The cry cut through the hallway like a blade, sharp, fragile, undeniable, and in that exact second, Emily Carter realized she had already been replaced. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above her as she stood just beyond the half-open door, her hand resting against the cold wall, her breath so quiet it almost disappeared into the sterile air, and inside that room, Daniel Hayes, her husband, was smiling in a way she hadn't seen in months, maybe longer, his voice low, steady, filled with something that used to belong to her. "You did it," he whispered, his fingers wrapped gently around another woman's hand. "You gave me a son." The words didn't echo. They sank. Heavy. Final. Emily didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The scene was clear enough, the monitors beeping in soft rhythm, the doctor's calm instructions fading into the background, the newborn's cry rising again like proof of something irreversible. Olivia Bennet lay there, exhausted but radiant, her eyes locked on Daniel as if the world had finally aligned exactly the way she wanted, and Daniel, he wasn't pretending anymore. No hesitation. No guilt. Just certainty. Emily felt it then, not like a break, not like something shattering, but like a quiet erasure, as if someone had slowly, carefully removed her from the story she thought she was still part of. For a moment, her fingers tightened against the wall, just enough to remind herself she was still there, still real, still breathing, and then she let go. A nurse brushed past her without a second glance. "Family?" the nurse asked softly, not even stopping. Emily paused, her eyes lingering one last time on the doorway, on the life continuing inside without her, and then she answered, her voice steady, almost distant. "No, just visiting." The lie didn't sting. It settled. Outside, the hallway stretched long and empty, polished floors reflecting the overhead lights like a path she hadn't planned to walk but suddenly understood she had no choice but to follow. Each step felt measured, controlled, deliberate, her heels clicking softly against the tile, a rhythm that grounded her more than any emotion could. Behind her, the cry of the baby faded, replaced by silence, and in that silence, something unfamiliar began to take shape, not pain, not anger, but clarity. Daniel had made his choice. Not today. Not in that room. Long before this moment. Emily reached the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers descend slowly, each second stretching just enough to make space for a memory she hadn't allowed herself to revisit in years. Another room, another promise, another version of herself who believed love was enough to bridge any gap, to erase any difference. She almost smiled at that thought. Almost. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and as she stepped inside, the reflection staring back at her didn't look broken. It looked resolved. Her phone buzzed once in her hand. Unknown number. She stared at it for a second, then answered. "Miss Carter," a calm voice said on the other end, measured, professional, familiar in a way that reached deeper than anything she had heard in that hospital. "The board is waiting for your decision." Emily's gaze didn't waver. Not anymore. "Tell them," she said quietly, her voice carrying something colder now, something precise. "I'm coming home." The doors closed, sealing the moment behind her, and for the first time since the cry echoed through that hallway, Emily Carter didn't feel invisible, she felt inevitable. The city lights stretched beneath the jet like scattered gold, distant and untouchable, the kind of view that once would have felt like a dream but now looked more like a memory Emily Carter had deliberately buried. She sat by the window, posture straight, hands resting calmly in her lap, the soft hum of the engine surrounding her in a steady, controlled rhythm that matched the new pace of her thoughts. 12 hours ago, she had been standing outside a hospital room, invisible in her own life. Now, she was crossing state lines at 30,000 feet, returning to a world that had never truly let her go. The flight attendant approached quietly, placing a glass of water beside her. "Miss Carter, we will be landing in New York in about 40 minutes. Emily nodded once, her expression unreadable, but her eyes shifted slightly toward the reflection in the window, catching a glimpse of herself that felt unfamiliar in its certainty. She was no longer waiting. Not for explanations. Not for apologies. Not for anything. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a string of messages stacking rapidly across the screen. Financial updates. Board confirmations. Legal notifications. Names she had not spoken in years were suddenly reaching for her again, drawn by the gravity of a name that carried weight far beyond what Daniel Hayes had ever understood. Carter Group. The name alone opened doors, closed deals, and rewrote outcomes before conversations even began. Emily had walked away from it once, believing she could build something simpler, something real, something based on love instead of leverage. That version of her had been sincere, honest, and completely unprepared for the kind of quiet betrayal that did not announce itself until it was already complete. She did not resent that version of herself. But she was not her anymore. The plane began its descent, the city rising up to meet her, glass towers reflecting the early morning light like a stage being prepared for a performance she had not attended in years. Somewhere below, decisions were waiting. Power was waiting. And for the first time, Emily was not hesitating to take it back. The moment the aircraft touched down, her phone rang. This time, she answered before the second ring. "Everything is in place," the voice on the other end said. "The board has been holding your seat for 7 years. They never filled it." Emily allowed a brief pause, just long enough to let the weight of that statement settle. 7 years? 7 years of absence, and yet her position had remained untouched, as if everyone knew she would return the moment she decided she was ready. "Schedule the meeting," she said, her tone even, precise. "Today." There was no surprise on the other end. Only compliance. "Of course, Ms. Carter." The call ended. Outside, a black car was already waiting at the private terminal, the driver stepping forward the moment she emerged, opening the door without a word. The city moved fast, but not faster than the shift already happening beneath its surface. By the time Emily stepped into the Carter Group headquarters, the air itself seemed different, charged with something unspoken but unmistakable. Conversation slowed. Eyes turned. Recognition spread quietly, like a ripple moving through still water. No announcement had been made. None was needed. The elevator doors opened directly into the executive floor, and as Emily stepped out, a long table of suited figures rose to their feet in perfect unison. No applause. No greetings. Just acknowledgement. Respect. And something else. Anticipation. Emily walked to the head of the table without rushing, without hesitation, her presence alone resetting the balance in the room before she even spoke. She placed her hand lightly on the back of the chair that had been waiting for her all along, then looked up, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Let us begin." The room did not breathe until she sat down, and even then, it was careful, measured, as if every person present understood that one wrong move could shift something they would not be able to recover from. Emily Carter lowered herself into the chair at the head of the table, her fingers resting lightly against the polished surface, her gaze moving across each face with quiet precision, not searching for approval, not offering reassurance, only assessing, calculating, remembering. Some of them had watched her grow up. Some had doubted she would ever return. And a few, she noted, had already begun to adjust their posture, their tone, their expectations, as if they could sense that whatever version of her had left 7 years ago was not the one who had just walked back in. "We will keep this simple," she said, her voice calm but carrying across the room without effort. "I want a full report on all external investments tied to Hayes Industries." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, the name landing like a quiet disruption among the executives. One of them cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter, Hayes Industries is not currently listed as one of our primary interests." Emily's eyes shifted toward him, not sharply, not aggressively, but with enough weight to make the rest of his sentence disappear before it formed. "It will be," she replied, and that was the end of the discussion. Screens lit up around the table, data appearing in layers, numbers and structures unfolding in real time as analysts worked to meet her directive, and within minutes, the outline of Daniel Hayes's empire began to take shape in front of her, not as something intimidating, not as something untouchable, but as something accessible. fragmented. Vulnerable in ways that only someone with the right resources could see. Emily leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged as she studied the projections, the debt lines, the expansion strategies that looked impressive on the surface but carried risks just beneath, risks that Daniel had either ignored or believed he could outrun. He had always been confident like that. Certain that momentum alone could protect him. Certain that no one was watching closely enough to understand where the cracks were forming. Emily almost admired that, in a distant way. Almost. Begin acquisition through subsidiaries, she said, her tone as steady as ever. Start with the smaller holdings. Quietly. Another executive spoke, more cautiously this time. And the timeline? Emily did not hesitate. Immediate. The word settled into the room with finality, and from that moment on, the energy shifted completely. This was no longer a discussion. It was execution. Orders moved quickly, messages sent out in coded language, financial channels activated with the kind of efficiency that only came from years of preparation and discipline. Emily did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to explain her reasoning. The structure around her responded because it recognized authority when it saw it. Because it remembered. Hours passed without anyone noticing, the city outside moving through its own rhythm while inside that glass tower, something far more deliberate was unfolding. By late afternoon, the first confirmations came in. Minority shares secured. Debt positions identified. Leverage points established. Nothing dramatic. Nothing visible. Not yet. Just a slow, precise tightening that would not be felt until it was too late to reverse. Emily stood from her chair, signaling the end of the meeting without needing to say it. As the executives began to gather their materials, she spoke one final time, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. Do not announce anything, she said. He does not need to know we are here. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long reflections across the city skyline, and somewhere across that same skyline, Daniel Hayes was still celebrating a future he believed was secure, unaware that the foundation beneath it had already begun to shift. Emily walked toward the window, her reflection merging briefly with the fading light, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the stillness again, not the emptiness from before, but something sharper, more defined, something that no longer asked for fairness or explanation. Only outcome. The headlines broke just after sunrise, clean and polished, designed to look effortless but timed with precision, and within minutes, the story had spread across every major outlet that mattered. Daniel Hayes stood at the center of it, smiling for cameras, one arm resting confidently around Olivia Bennet as she held their newborn son, the image carefully framed to suggest stability, success, and a future that seemed impossible to question. A new chapter, one reporter called it. A growing legacy, another added. Daniel did not correct them. He leaned into it, his voice measured, his words chosen with the same calculated confidence that had built his reputation over the past decade. Family changes everything, he said, glancing down at the child with a softness that looked convincing enough to sell the moment to millions of viewers who did not know the full story. Olivia stood beside him, composed, elegant, her presence already adapting to the attention as if she had been preparing for it long before this day arrived. The narrative was simple. Clear. Clean. And entirely incomplete. Across the city, inside a quiet office high above the noise, Emily Carter watched the broadcast without expression, her reflection faintly visible against the screen as Daniel's voice filled the room. She did not turn it off. She let it play. Every word. Every angle. Every carefully constructed sentence that painted a version of reality designed to erase what came before. A younger version of her might have reacted. Might have questioned how something so personal could be rewritten so quickly, so publicly, without hesitation. But now, she only observed, her mind already moving ahead of the moment, calculating where the pressure points would shift next. Her phone lit up with alerts, not from news outlets, but from internal systems tracking movement within Hayes Industries, and the pattern was exactly what she expected. Increased investment interest. Short-term spikes in valuation. New partnerships being proposed on the back of public sentiment. It looked like growth. It looked like momentum. It looked temporary. They are accelerating expansion, one of her analysts said quietly from across the room, reviewing the incoming data. New contracts. New deadlines. They are moving fast. Emily nodded once, her attention still on the screen as Daniel continued speaking, his confidence unwavering, his certainty absolute. Of course they are, she said calmly. He believes he is winning. The words were not emotional. They were observational. A simple statement of timing. She stepped closer to the window, the city stretching endlessly below, alive with movement, unaware of the quiet shift already underway beneath its surface. Increase pressure on the secondary holdings, she added, her tone steady. Do not touch the core assets yet. The analyst hesitated for half a second. You want him to keep expanding. Emily finally looked away from the screen, her gaze settling with quiet clarity. I want him to believe nothing is wrong. The room fell silent again, not out of confusion, but understanding. This was not about confrontation. Not yet. This was about allowing the illusion to grow, to stretch, to build itself high enough that when it shifted, it would not be able to recover its balance. Back on the screen, Daniel turned slightly toward Olivia, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder as cameras flashed, capturing the image from every angle, freezing it into a moment that would be shared, replayed, admired. A perfect picture. A perfect narrative. Emily watched for a second longer, then reached out and turned the screen off. The room returned to quiet. No applause. No reaction. Just focus. Prepare the invitation list, she said, her voice soft but decisive. For the Carter Foundation Gala. The analyst looked up. You want him there. Emily's expression did not change. He will come, she replied. And this time, there was something just beneath her words, something sharper than before, something that did not rush, did not rise, but waited, steady and inevitable, for the exact moment it would no longer need to remain unseen. The invitation arrived on Daniel Hayes's desk just before noon, placed neatly among contracts and financial reports as if it carried no more weight than any other piece of correspondence, but the envelope itself said otherwise. Heavy stock, embossed lettering, the Carter Foundation seal pressed deep into the surface with quiet authority that did not need explanation. Daniel noticed it immediately. Not because of the design, but because of the name. Carter. He picked it up slowly, turning it once in his hand as if expecting something more to reveal itself before he even opened it, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar flickered across his expression, something that did not belong to the confident narrative he had been building so carefully over the past few days. Olivia, seated across from him, glanced up from her phone. What is it? She asked lightly, her tone casual but her eyes attentive. Daniel did not answer right away. He opened the envelope with measured precision, sliding out the invitation and reading it once, then again, his jaw tightening just enough to register if someone had been watching closely. The Carter Foundation Annual Gala. Formal. Exclusive. By invitation only. He exhaled slowly, placing the card down on his desk, but not too far from reach. It is nothing, he said, though the words came a fraction too late to sound completely effortless. Olivia tilted her head slightly. Does not look like nothing. Daniel forced a small smile, the kind he used in interviews, controlled and reassuring. It is just another charity event. High profile, yes, but nothing unusual. He did not mention the part that mattered. That he had never been invited before. Not once in all the years he had built Hayes Industries into something worth noticing. Not once when he was climbing. Not once when he was rising. And now, suddenly, he was being called in. The timing sat wrong. Subtle. Quiet. But wrong. Across the city, Emily Carter stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror as a stylist adjusted the final details of her evening attire, the fabric falling perfectly into place, every line intentional, every element chosen not for display, but for presence. She did not rush. She did not second-guess. The transformation was not external. It had already happened the moment she stepped back into that boardroom. This was simply the visual confirmation of something that had always been true, something she had once hidden and would never conceal again. Her phone rested on the table beside her, the screen lighting up briefly with a message that required no response. Confirmation of attendance. Daniel Hayes. Emily's gaze did not shift toward it. She already knew he would come. Not because he understood why he was being invited, but because he believed he belonged in every room that carried influence. That confidence had built his world. It would also guide him exactly where she needed him to be. "Everything is ready, Ms. Carter," the assistant said softly from behind her. Emily gave a small nod, her eyes meeting her own reflection, steady, composed, unshaken by the noise that was already beginning to build around the evening. The city outside was preparing for another event, another gathering of power and visibility, but beneath that surface, something far more deliberate was aligning. Back in his office, Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the invitation once more, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk in a rhythm that betrayed a thought he had not fully formed yet. He told himself it was an opportunity, a sign that he had reached the level he had been aiming for, that the recognition he deserved was finally arriving. But somewhere beneath that reasoning, quieter and harder to ignore, was a question he could not quite answer. Why now? The room felt still around him, the usual confidence settling back into place as he straightened, adjusting his jacket as if preparing for something already decided. "We will attend," he said, more to himself than anyone else. And with that, the decision was made, not realizing it had never truly been his to make. The ballroom shimmered under layers of soft, golden light, the kind that made every surface appear more refined, more intentional, as if nothing imperfect could exist within its reach, and yet beneath that polished surface, the air carried a subtle tension that most guests could not name but instinctively felt. Conversations flowed easily, glasses clinked in quiet celebration, and names of influence moved from one corner of the room to another like currency, exchanged with practiced ease. Daniel Hayes stepped through the grand entrance with Olivia Bennet at his side, his posture confident, his expression composed, every detail of his appearance carefully aligned with the image he had spent years building. Cameras turned. Heads followed. Recognition came quickly, fueled by recent headlines and the story that had already begun to define his next chapter. Olivia matched his pace effortlessly, her presence refined, her gaze steady as she adjusted slightly to the attention, not overwhelmed by it, but not entirely immune either. This was her introduction to a different level of visibility, one that did not forgive hesitation. "Stay close," Daniel murmured under his breath, not as a command, but as a reminder, his hand briefly guiding her forward before releasing again, maintaining the appearance of ease. Across the room, executives, investors, and social figures acknowledged his arrival with polite nods, some offering greetings, others simply observing, measuring, calculating where he now stood within the shifting hierarchy of influence. Daniel responded with the same controlled charm, shaking hands, exchanging brief words, his confidence returning to full strength with each interaction that reinforced his place in the room. Whatever hesitation he had felt earlier had been pushed aside, replaced by the familiar rhythm of recognition and status. He belonged here. That belief settled back into him with quiet certainty. And yet as the minutes passed, something remained slightly off, not visible, not obvious, but present in the way certain conversations paused just a fraction longer than expected, in the way a few glances moved past him toward the entrance, as if anticipating something more. Olivia noticed it first, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned closer. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly. Daniel followed her gaze, scanning the room, but everything appeared as it should, elegant, composed, controlled. "It is just the crowd," he replied, though the answer lacked the firmness it normally carried. Then, without announcement, without music shifting or lights dimming, the atmosphere changed. It was subtle at first. A quiet redirection of attention. Conversations slowing. Movements adjusting. The kind of shift that could only happen when someone entered who did not need introduction. At the far end of the ballroom, near the main staircase, a figure stepped into view, and the effect was immediate, though no one spoke it aloud. Emily Carter did not rush. She did not seek attention. She did not acknowledge the room before it acknowledged her. Every step was measured, every movement precise, her presence cutting cleanly through the layered noise of the evening without raising its volume. The details followed a second later, the recognition, the realization, the quiet exchange of names whispered just low enough to remain controlled but loud enough to spread. Carter. It moved through the room like a current, connecting conversations, aligning focus, resetting the balance in a way that did not require explanation. Daniel's gaze locked forward, his expression holding for a moment longer than necessary before something shifted, something small but undeniable, as recognition surfaced not just of a name, but of a face he had not expected to see again, not here, not like this. Olivia felt it too, the subtle change in his posture, the slight tension that replaced his earlier ease. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more careful. Daniel did not answer immediately. He could not. Because the woman walking toward the center of the room was not the version of Emily he had left behind. Not the one he had dismissed. Not the one he believed had nothing to offer beyond what he had already taken. This Emily did not look back. She did not hesitate. She moved forward as if the room had always been hers, and as the distance between them closed, the illusion Daniel had been holding on to began, quietly and precisely, to lose its shape. Emily Carter stopped at the center of the ballroom, not because she needed to, but because the room itself seemed to settle around her, as if every conversation, every movement, every glance had quietly aligned to that exact point, and for a moment, there was no music, no laughter, no distraction strong enough to compete with the shift that had just taken place. She did not look for Daniel. She did not search for Olivia. She simply stood there, composed, her presence alone enough to draw the attention of those who understood what her name meant beyond headlines or rumors. A senior board member approached first, his expression respectful, almost relieved. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice carrying just enough to confirm what many were already beginning to suspect. "It is good to have you back." The words traveled faster than any announcement could, moving from one cluster of guests to another, connecting the recognition into something undeniable. Back. Not introduced. Not invited. Returned. Daniel felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle tightening in the room, the way the narrative he had been holding on to began to slip, piece by piece, under the weight of something far more established than his recent success. Olivia's hand brushed lightly against his arm. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice no longer casual, no longer certain. "You know her." It was not a question. He stepped forward before thinking, drawn by a mix of disbelief and something deeper he could not name, his pace measured but no longer entirely controlled. "Emily," he said when he reached her, the name leaving his mouth slower than it should have, as if saying it required him to acknowledge something he had already dismissed. Emily turned then, her gaze meeting his without hesitation, without emotion, without any trace of the past he expected to find there. "Daniel," she replied, her tone even, polite, distant in a way that made the familiarity between them feel almost misplaced. For a brief second either of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough for those nearby to lean closer, not openly, but instinctively, sensing that whatever was about to unfold carried more than simple recognition. Daniel forced a small smile, the kind that had carried him through countless negotiations, but this time it did not land the same way. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, attempting to regain control of the moment, to frame it within something he could still manage. Emily's expression did not change. "That is understandable," she replied calmly. "You were not meant to." The words were not sharp. They did not need to be. Their meaning settled immediately, precise and unchallenged. Olivia stepped closer now, her posture straightening as she tried to place herself within the exchange. "And you are?" she asked, her tone controlled but edged with uncertainty she could not fully hide. Emily shifted her gaze to her briefly, not dismissive, not confrontational, simply acknowledging. "Emily Carter," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach beyond the immediate circle, to connect with the awareness already spreading through the room. The name did the rest. It moved through the space with quiet authority, confirming what had only been whispered seconds before, solidifying the shift that had already begun. Daniel's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the realization settling into place, connecting the invitation, the timing, the attention, the subtle shifts he had dismissed earlier. Carter! He repeated under his breath, the word no longer abstract, no longer distant. Emily watched him for a moment, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering, and then she spoke again, her voice softer now but no less certain. I believe you received my invitation. It was not a question. It was confirmation. And in that moment, as the room held its quiet focus, Daniel understood something he had not considered until now, something that had been set into motion long before he stepped into this ballroom, something that no longer waited for his approval or his understanding to unfold. The evening had never been about recognition. It had always been about timing. And he had just arrived exactly where he was meant to. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire room understood that whatever came next would not be undone once spoken, and Emily Carter allowed that silence to settle fully before she took a single step forward, not toward Daniel, not toward Olivia, but toward the center of the space where attention naturally gathered. She did not raise her voice, yet when she spoke, it carried with quiet clarity that reached every corner of the ballroom. Tonight, she began, her tone composed, measured. The Carter Foundation celebrates growth, responsibility, and the kind of leadership that builds something lasting. There was no hesitation in her delivery, no trace of uncertainty, only control, as if every word had already been placed exactly where it needed to be long before she arrived. Screens around the room lit up at her signal, subtle at first, then unmistakable, drawing eyes upward as data appeared in clean, precise lines, numbers arranged in a way that did not confuse but clarified. Daniel felt it immediately, the shift from social event to something else entirely, something structured, intentional, and far beyond his control. Over the past 48 hours, Emily continued, Carter Group has finalized a series of acquisitions through its subsidiaries. She paused, just long enough for the information to register, for curiosity to sharpen into focus. Among those assets, she added, her gaze steady, are key holdings connected to Hayes Industries. The words landed softly, but their impact spread quickly, moving through the room in a wave of quiet realization. Conversation stopped completely now. Daniel's posture stiffened, his expression holding as he processed what she had just said, the pieces beginning to align in a way that made the earlier signs impossible to ignore. That is not possible, he said, his voice controlled but edged with disbelief, stepping slightly closer as if proximity could restore some sense of balance. Emily turned her head just enough to meet his gaze again, her expression unchanged. It is already done, she replied. No emphasis. No escalation. Just fact. One of the screens shifted, displaying a clean breakdown of ownership percentages, debt positions, and contractual leverage points, each line reinforcing the same conclusion from a different angle. Not speculation. Not threat. Structure. Reality. Olivia looked from the screen to Daniel, her confidence faltering as the narrative she had stepped into began to unravel in ways she had not prepared for. Daniel, she whispered, but he did not respond. He was still looking at the data, still trying to find the gap, the error, the point where he could push back and reassert control. But there was none. Because this had not been built in a moment. It had been prepared. Quietly. Precisely. You expanded too quickly, Emily said, her voice softer now, not directed at the room, but at him alone, though everyone heard it. You assumed momentum would protect you. Daniel's jaw tightened, his confidence no longer returning the way it had before, the familiar certainty slipping under the weight of something he could not outmaneuver. What do you want? He asked finally, the question forced, but necessary. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then looked away, as if the answer was not something she needed to deliver directly. Nothing. she said calmly. This is not about taking something from you. Another pause. Controlled. Deliberate. It is about showing you what was never yours to begin with. The room remained silent, not out of confusion, but understanding, as the structure continued to unfold across the screens, each detail reinforcing the same shift in power that had already taken place. Daniel stood still, no longer the center of the room, no longer the figure the evening had been built around, but part of something larger he had not seen until it was too late to change. And Emily, without raising her voice, without stepping closer, without any visible display of force, had already moved everything exactly where it needed to be. The silence did not break immediately, it stretched, tightened, settled into the kind of stillness that forced every person in the room to confront what they had just witnessed, not as a spectacle, but as a shift that could not be undone once understood. Daniel Hayes stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the screens as if staring long enough might rearrange the numbers into something familiar, something manageable, but they did not change. They remained exactly as they were, precise, structured, irreversible. Around him, the room had already begun to adjust, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle ways that mattered most. Conversations restarted, but quieter now, more deliberate. Eyes that once held admiration now carried calculation. Distance. Reassessment. Olivia stepped back half a step without realizing it, her hand no longer resting against his arm, her posture shifting as the confidence she had worn so easily began to dissolve under the weight of something she could not influence or control. This is just a strategy move," she said, her voice low, searching for stability in words that no longer carried certainty. "You can respond to this." Daniel did not look at her. He was still focused on Emily, still trying to locate the point where he could regain footing, where he could reframe what was happening into something temporary, something negotiable. "You orchestrated all of this," he said finally, his tone quieter now, less certain, but still holding on to the last thread of authority he believed he possessed. Emily met his gaze again, her expression unchanged, not defensive, not proud, simply present. "No," she replied calmly. "I allowed it to happen." The distinction settled heavily, its meaning clearer than any explanation could have been. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to create the illusion of privacy, though everyone near them could still hear. "Then tell me what you want," he said again, this time without resistance, without pretense, the question no longer strategic, but necessary. Emily watched him for a moment, not measuring his words, but the shift behind them, the moment where certainty had given way to realization. "You built something impressive," she said, her voice steady, almost reflective. "But you built it on assumptions." Another pause, deliberate, controlled. That no one was watching. That no one had more leverage. That silence meant absence. Daniel's jaw tightened again, but this time there was no immediate response, no counterargument ready to follow. Because he understood. Not completely. Not comfortably. But enough. Emily continued, her tone never rising, never shifting into anything that resembled confrontation. "You were wrong about all of those things." The words were simple. Direct. Final. Around them, the screens dimmed slightly as the presentation concluded, leaving only the lingering awareness of what had been revealed, what had already taken effect beyond the walls of that room. Olivia looked between them, her expression no longer composed, her place within the situation becoming increasingly uncertain as the foundation she had stepped into shifted beneath her. "Daniel," she started again, but this time the name carried no direction, no solution. Daniel finally looked at her, just for a second, and in that brief glance, something passed between them, not blame, not anger, but recognition that whatever future they had been presenting only hours ago had already begun to fracture in ways neither of them could stop. Emily turned slightly, her attention moving away from them, not dismissive, not dramatic, simply done with the part of the evening that required their presence. "This is not a negotiation," she said quietly, not looking back. "It is a correction." The words settled differently than anything before it, not as an attack, but as something inevitable, something that had been set in motion long before any of them realized it was happening. And as she stepped away, the space she left behind did not close, did not reset, because what had changed in that room was not temporary, not reversible, but already moving forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. The music did not return right away, and even when it did, it felt softer, distant, as if the room itself had not fully decided how to move forward from what had just taken place. Daniel Hayes remained where he stood for a moment longer, the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable in the way it shifted every interaction around him. People still spoke to him, still nodded, still acknowledged his presence, but something had changed in the tone, in the timing, in the space they kept between themselves and him. Respect had not disappeared. It had been recalculated. Olivia adjusted her posture again, smoothing her dress as if restoring composure could restore control, but her eyes moved differently now, scanning the room not for admiration, but for stability, for something she could still hold onto as the narrative she had stepped into continued to shift beneath her. "We should leave," she said quietly, her voice steady but no longer certain. Daniel did not respond immediately. His attention had moved past her, past the guests, toward the far end of the ballroom where Emily now stood speaking with a group of board members, her presence integrated seamlessly into the structure of the event as if she had always been at its center. No rush. No reaction. Just continuity. That unsettled him more than anything else. Not the data. Not the exposure. But the fact that she had already moved on while he was still trying to understand what had happened. "No," he said finally, his tone controlled, though quieter than before. "Not yet." Because leaving now would confirm something he was not ready to accept. That the ground beneath him had already shifted beyond recovery. Across the room, a new set of screens quietly updated, not for presentation this time, but for internal monitoring, and within minutes, notifications began to ripple through the network of attendees connected to financial markets and corporate channels. Subtle changes. Adjustments. Movements that mirrored what had already been revealed. Hayes Industries stock projections began to fluctuate. Not collapsing. Not dramatic. But unstable. Questioned. Watched. The kind of movement that did not destroy a company overnight, but slowly removed the certainty it depended on to grow. Daniel felt it before he saw it, the shift in attention, the subtle distancing, the conversations that no longer included him as the central figure but referenced him as a variable. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, scanning the updates with a focus that bordered on urgency now, his mind racing to calculate responses, counter-moves, ways to stabilize what was beginning to move beyond his control. But every option required time. And time was the one thing he no longer had in abundance. "Daniel," Olivia said again, softer this time, not demanding, not directing, but uncertain, her place beside him no longer anchored by the same confidence it had been built on. He looked at her, really looked this time, and in that brief moment, something became clear in a way it had not been before. This was not just about business. Not just about strategy. It was about everything he had chosen, everything he had assumed would remain fixed as he moved forward without looking back. And now, all of it was being measured under a different standard. Across the room, Emily Carter finished her conversation, her attention shifting briefly toward the exit, then back again, as if the evening had already given her exactly what she needed. She did not look for Daniel again. She did not need to. The outcome had already been set into motion. As she turned slightly, preparing to move, her assistant stepped beside her, speaking quietly. "The next phase is ready." Emily gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, her voice low but clear. "Good," she said. "Let it continue." No announcement. No signal. Just movement. And behind her, without noise, without spectacle, the structures she had put in place continued forward, not waiting, not pausing, not asking for acknowledgement. Daniel lowered his phone slowly, the screen still lit with numbers that no longer aligned with the certainty he had relied on, and for the first time that evening, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. This was not a moment. It was a direction. And it had already begun. By the time the evening began to thin, the shift had already extended far beyond the walls of the ballroom, moving through financial channels, private conversations, and quiet decisions made in real time by people who understood exactly what had just been set into motion. Daniel Hayes stood near the edge of the room now, no longer at its center, his presence still acknowledged but no longer defining, his phone lighting up continuously with updates that arrived faster than he could fully process them. Messages from advisors. Alerts from analysts. Subtle warnings wrapped in professional language that all pointed to the same reality. Confidence in Hayes Industries was no longer stable. Not broken. Not collapsed. But questioned. And in his world, that was enough to change everything. He read each notification carefully, his expression tightening not with panic, but with the growing awareness that every move he made from this point forward would be reactive, not strategic. That realization settled heavier than anything Emily had said out loud. Across the room, Olivia stood slightly apart now, engaged in a conversation that did not quite hold her attention, her eyes drifting occasionally back toward Daniel, searching for reassurance that no longer came automatically. The distance between them was not physical. It was structural. The kind that formed when the foundation beneath a shared future began to shift in ways either of them had anticipated. "We need to respond," she said quietly when she finally stepped back toward him, her voice careful, as if choosing the right tone might still restore something that had already begun to unravel. Daniel nodded once, but the gesture lacked conviction. "I will handle it," he replied, though the words felt different now, heavier, less certain of their own authority. Because handling it was no longer about control. It was about containment. And containment meant acknowledging limits he had never considered before. At the far end of the ballroom, Emily Carter moved toward the exit without announcement, her steps unhurried, her presence no longer drawing the same focused attention because it did not need to. What she had come to do was already complete. The rest would unfold without her standing in the center of it. As she passed through the final stretch of the room, a few voices called her name, respectful, composed, but she acknowledged them only with a small nod, her attention already beyond the moment, already aligned with what came next. Outside, the air was cooler, the city quieter in contrast to the contained energy of the gala, and for the first time since stepping into that hospital hallway, Emily paused, just briefly, not to reflect, not to question, but to recognize the stillness that now existed without pressure, without expectation. Her assistant stepped beside her, holding out a tablet with updated figures, projections already adjusting in real time. "The transition is progressing faster than expected," he said. Emily glanced at the screen, her eyes moving across the numbers with calm precision, then handed it back. "It will stabilize," she replied. Not hopeful. Not uncertain. Just factual. Behind her, through the glass, the ballroom continued, the event reshaping itself around a new understanding that would carry into the days ahead, into decisions not yet made, into outcomes that were already beginning to take form. Inside, Daniel remained where he was, his world not collapsing, not disappearing, but changing in a way that would require him to rebuild without the assumptions he had once relied on so completely. And for the first time, as he looked out across the room that no longer responded to him the same way, he understood something he had not seen before. That silence was never empty. It was only waiting. And the moment it ended, everything that had been unseen moved forward all at once. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light stretching across the glass towers of the city as if nothing had changed, as if the previous night had been just another event among many. But beneath that calm surface, the movement continued, quiet and precise, reshaping positions that once felt permanent. Daniel Hayes stood in his office overlooking the skyline, the same view he had once considered a symbol of everything he had built, everything he controlled, and now it looked different, not smaller, not diminished, but no longer entirely his. The reports on his desk were neatly arranged, but their content carried a different weight than before. Revised projections. Adjusted partnerships. Deferred commitments? None of them catastrophic. All of them significant. He read through them slowly, not searching for reassurance anymore, but understanding the pattern forming beneath the numbers. Stability had not disappeared. It had been challenged. And once questioned, it could not be restored by confidence alone. Behind him, Olivia moved quietly through the space. Her presence more reserved now, no longer aligned with the certainty that had defined her just days before. She paused near the window, her reflection faint against the glass as she looked out at the same skyline, but her thoughts were elsewhere, shifting, recalibrating. "This is not over," she said finally, her voice measured, but softer than before. Daniel did not turn immediately. He closed the final report, placing it carefully on the desk before responding. "No," he said. "It is not." But the words carried a different meaning now, not a promise of dominance, not a declaration of control, but an acknowledgement of reality. Olivia studied him for a moment, searching for the version of him she had aligned herself with, the one who moved forward without hesitation, without doubt, and for the first time, she could not find him in the same way. Not gone, but changed. "I need to think about what this means," she said quietly, the distance in her voice more defined now, less uncertain, more intentional. Daniel nodded once, not arguing, not stopping her, because he understood that what they had built together had been tied to a trajectory that no longer existed in the same form. She moved toward the door without rushing, pausing only briefly before stepping out, leaving the space behind her not empty, but different. Daniel remained where he was, the silence settling in again, but this time it was not unfamiliar. It was clear. Across the city, Emily Carter stood in her own office, the morning light falling evenly across the room, her desk free of clutter, her environment structured with the same precision she applied to everything else. The screens in front of her displayed updates that aligned exactly with what she had expected, each movement unfolding within the parameters she had already set into motion. No surprises. No deviations. Just continuation. Her assistant entered quietly, placing a tablet beside her. "The transition is stabilizing," he said. Emily glanced at the figures briefly, then looked away, her attention already beyond the numbers, beyond the immediate outcome. "Good," she replied simply. She stepped toward the window, her reflection merging with the city beyond, not as someone returning to claim something lost, but as someone who had never truly been absent, only waiting for the moment when silence no longer needed to hold its place. And as she stood there, looking out at a skyline that had not changed but no longer felt the same, the difference was not in what she had taken back, but in what she had never needed to ask for again. Weeks passed, and the city adjusted the way it always did, not with noise, not with announcements, but with quiet acceptance of what had already changed, and in that time, the story that once centered around Daniel Hayes no longer held the same weight it used to. His name still appeared in reports, still carried influence, but it no longer moved through conversations as certainty, only as a variable, something to be evaluated rather than followed. Hayes Industries did not disappear. It did not collapse. It adapted slowly, carefully, under pressure that forced every decision to be measured against a reality he had not accounted for before. Daniel himself moved differently now, not weaker, not broken, but aware in a way he had never needed to be, each step considered, each choice made with an understanding that momentum alone was no longer enough. Across the same skyline, Emily Carter continued forward without interruption, her presence integrated into the structure of the world she had reclaimed, not loudly, not for display, but with a steadiness that did not require recognition to remain absolute. Her name moved through boardrooms, through partnerships, through decisions that shaped outcomes far beyond what could be seen on the surface, and yet she never returned to that hospital, never revisited the moment that had once defined the shift in her path. She did not need to. Because what had happened there was no longer a wound. It was a point of clarity. One afternoon, standing once again by the window of her office, the same quiet city stretching endlessly below, Emily received a brief update from her assistant, not urgent, not unexpected, simply part of the ongoing flow of information that no longer disrupted her rhythm. Hayes Industries has finalized restructuring, he said. They are stabilizing. Emily gave a small nod, her eyes remaining on the skyline, not reacting, not adjusting, just acknowledging. They will, she replied calmly. There was no satisfaction in her voice. No triumph. Only certainty. Because this had never been about destruction. It had been about balance. About truth aligning with consequence. Behind her, the room remained still, organized, controlled, a reflection of the world she now moved within without resistance, without hesitation. And for a moment, just a moment, her thoughts drifted, not backward, not into regret, but into recognition of something simple, something that did not require explanation. That silence, the kind she had chosen in that hallway, had never been weakness. It had been space. Space to see clearly. Space to decide. Space to return not louder, but stronger in a way that did not need to prove itself. The city lights began to shift as evening approached, the skyline glowing with the same quiet intensity it always carried, unchanged and yet never the same twice, and Emily stood there, not above it, not separate from it, but aligned with it in a way that required nothing more than her presence. Somewhere else in that same city, Daniel Hayes continued forward, learning in real time what it meant to rebuild without assumption, without certainty, without the belief that control was something permanent. Their paths no longer crossed. They did not need to. Because the lesson had already been delivered, not in words, not in confrontation, but in outcome. And in the end, there was nothing left to say, only something to understand. That some men lose everything they thought they owned, not because someone took it from them, but because they never truly understood what it was worth,